I've been doing a lot of thinking about identity recently. Subjects like what it means to be an individual or have you-ness, what sorts of things we can truly know about our psychological origins, and the kinds of pursuits we ought to spend our time on have been a lot of fun to think about, and making these videos has really helped me clarify my thoughts, or at least identify the things I know I don't know. I'd like to thank everyone who has listened, liked, commented, or subscribed. I hope you find these topics as interesting and thought-provoking as I do. I'm glad you're here. Today I want to talk about an idea I got from my last video. Specifically, David Hume's idea that all our thoughts and imagination are limited to an interpretation or transformation of our sensory impressions. That's to say, you can't imagine something you have not seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or felt. A famous example of this principle is the challenge to imagine a color you haven't seen. I'd put one on screen right now, but yeah, you get it. Later in the video, I'll relate this back to why ancient people's ideas about how the world worked were so wrong. For now, let's talk about impressions. Our imaginations are limited to interpretations and reinterpretations of our sensory impressions, and therefore, any meaning that is associated with those impressions is learned. Usually, as the variance in cultural norms across the world attests, we make these associations as we're exposed to more and more sensory impressions. Or to put it in a way that normal human beings speak, experience things. If we're lucky, we continue to make new associations and alter our old ones as long as we live. Imagine, if you can, starting your life out blind, deaf, mute, unable to feel, taste, smell, or move. For the sake of this thought experiment, you're a brain in a jar. You receive nutrition and oxygen through the jar you're in. In this sense, no pun intended, you're unable to experience anything but your own thoughts. But how would that thinking work? How can you learn anything or make any associations? Remember, you wouldn't even have a language in which your thoughts are coded. Or would your cognitive existence be a disordered stream of consciousness, almost random in its inability to intentionally repeat itself? What sorts of things could be imagined in this state? Remember, you haven't experienced anything. I suppose, to go back to René Descartes, you would at least be aware of your own thinking, that something was going on. Maybe you would identify that stream of consciousness as yourself. Maybe some deep, subconscious you would interpret that stream of consciousness as the entirety of the universe. And for you, I suppose, would it not be? Perhaps whatever the you is would think of itself as a spectator of that stream of consciousness, an observer. All of these thinkings, I'm not sure if thoughts is even the right word, would be necessarily abstract. I'm not arguing that there would be no brain activity. I'm sure that something would show up on a brain scan. I'm more interested in any meaning or interpretation that the brain would make in this circumstance. It's mind-boggling, but fun to think about what this world without a world would be like, if it's even possible. Now, I'm far from the first person to wonder about these sorts of things. Plato's allegory of the cave has me beat by about 2,300 years and asks a similar question. That is, what are the factors affecting our perception of reality? Luckily, the people in the cave can sense things and interpret the shadow puppets they see accordingly. The brain in the jar can't do either. I wonder if there are certain things, shapes, colors, smells, that we've evolved to know even if we've never seen them, or in the case of our brain in the jar, never could. Aposematism comes to mind, where animals naturally know to stay away from brightly colored animals or plants. I'm not sure how this information might affect our brain in the jar. Even if it's wired to avoid bright colored objects, without the ability to ever see them, could our brain imagine them? The brain reacts to stimuli automatically, but can it generate images from that base programming? Even if, for example, a blind person could envision something like the color red, how could they ever convey what it is without being able to make a comparison to red in the external world? I wonder if there are any shapes, forms, smells, or sounds that our brains are programmed to avoid or fear, but we're unaware of because they no longer exist. What sorts of concepts could be imagined about something as fundamental to life as water, for example? It occurs to me that needing it and knowing it, or attaching meaning to it, are completely different things. Our brain in the jar has everything it needs. Could it conceive of something it has no sense to perceive? I think not. No more than an amoeba conceives of the water it swims through. Unless there is something glaring that I'm missing, it seems clear to me that thought without sensory impression is, if not impossible, impossible to imagine, just as impossible as it would be for me to really know what it is to be you without having lived your life. Without the ability to experience the world outside our minds, we can't know anything about it. The more senses we possess, and tools we have to enhance those senses, the more we can discover. I guess this means I'm an empiricist now. With all this in mind, I want to turn now to the examination of a pre-Socratic philosopher's ideas on how the universe is constituted. A lot of his ideas seem, well, crazy to our modern minds, but I think the previous discussion of reasoning with limited empirical information helps explain why, or at least how, he came to some of those conclusions. Thales lived 2,600 years ago and was perhaps the first philosopher. The school he founded is called the Milesian School, named after the city he lived in, Miletus. Once again, I consulted my source book in Ancient Philosophy by Charles Bakewell, who writes of Aristotle's account of Thales. Most of the early philosophers were content to seek a material first principle as the cause of all things. For that of which all things consist, from which they arise, into which they pass away, the substance remaining is what they mean by the element, or the first principle, of the things that are. And this is why they hold that, strictly speaking, nothing comes into being or perishes, since the primal nature remains ever the same. Thales reasoned that water was the material first principle. That is to say, he believed that all things are constituted of water. The different substances, let's say a rock and skin, are composed of water, but each has been changed in such a way to produce a rock or skin, respectively. Regardless of what has happened to make rock or skin, each would turn back into water when they break down. Thales' reason for believing this doesn't rely on his ability to look at a rock or skin under a microscope, or induce changes in those substances by introducing them to various chemical solvents. He didn't have that technology or epistemological framework. No, Aristotle proposes that Thales reasoned that the nourishment of all things is moist, and that heat itself is generated and kept alive by moisture. He continues that Thales observed, germs of all things are moist, and that moist things have water as the first principle of their nature. One part of the idea of a first principle that I find interesting is the one that nothing comes into being or perishes since the primal nature remains ever the same. Does that sound familiar? It's close to the first law of thermodynamics, which states that energy can be transformed from one form to another, but can be neither created nor destroyed. Now, I'm not a physicist, but is there not an idea in quantum physics that states that all particles, or at least photons, are at their root waves, that is to say, energy? Aristotle tells us that even the Milesians didn't agree on what the first principle was, and who knows, maybe one of them did think it was energy. Replace water with waves, and the Milesian idea of a first principle stands. The important distinction, however, is that the Milesians did not reason that energy was the first principle of the world. How could they have? And even if they had, they could not have meant it in the same way, imbued with the same meaning as quantum physicists imbue it today, which, I think you will agree, produces a more reliable model of reality, one we can test and find support for or against. The ancients simply lacked the tools required to make those kinds of empirical observations. It's also worth noting that their epistemology, that is to say, the mechanisms by which they believed they could derive knowledge, did not include induction or testing out any of their ideas. Anaximander was Thales' successor, proposed the boundless as a first principle, by which he meant some substratum that existed outside the elements recognized by the Greeks, in which those elements interacted. I suppose there is a way to interpret this as some sort of energy, but I think that would be a huge stretch. As a quick but I think fun aside, Anaximander also sort of gives us his own version, however rudimentary, of the theory of evolution. He reasoned that mankind originated as a fish-like creature, based on the observation that we come into the world unable to feed ourselves, and such creatures could not have survived, so must have derived from something else. Good reasoning. Whether we are a brain in a jar, or a godlike alien creature who can answer the questions posed by quantum physics with super advanced technology, the ability to understand the universe around us and draw meaning from it is dependent on our capacity to perceive, whether through our natural sensory perception or the aid of technology. Thales reasoned that the formal cause of all things was water because he didn't have an electron microscope. It's this ability to look closer that propels us towards something that might be called the truth. It at least allows us to construct more accurate models of reality if truth is a term you feel uncomfortable with. I get that. As much as we feel we know now, and as miraculous as our technology might seem to us, I wonder how many of the theories that we hold sacrosanct will seem ridiculous when mankind is as far removed from us as we are from Thales and Anaximander. Still, I can't help but look back on those guys with admiration. Striving for explanations, to understand the universe in and outside of our minds is a noble goal, and it is never quite realized. There are still a lot of empirical questions that remain unanswered in science, so many questions that we haven't even thought to ask yet. I marvel at the possibilities, and I wonder what discoveries lie waiting, just past the horizon of our ability to perceive them.